So that's where I would say the hot take is, hey, if you're building an internal tool to access customer stuff, think about role-based and resource-based access. Think about customer transparency, visibility. Make sure that audit logs are available so they can see what people did, and make sure that they can request or approve or deny that access. Trivial to implement early on. So simple to implement early on. If you say it's not, I get it. There's edge cases that say you're wrong. Just do it. Because that is actually really, really hard later.
Welcome to the Elephant in AppSec, the podcast to explore, challenge, and boldly face the AppSec elephants in the room. I'm Alexandra, your host and AppSec enthusiast and growth manager at Escape, an API discovery and security platform. Today, my guest is Rob Picard. Rob started his career as a pen tester and went on to become an early security hire at both Robinhood and Vanta, where he helped establish scalable security programs. He is now leading Observa, a security consulting firm focused on helping startups build strong security foundations. Rob frequently participates in podcasts, sharing his expertise on how startups can develop security programs, often with an AppSec focus. Quick special announcement for the Elephant in AppSec. In November, we are hosting the first Elephant in AppSec virtual conference. Join us and hear from speakers who aren't afraid to share their strong opinions. But now, back to this episode. In this episode, Rob discusses when startups should adopt application security, the key differences between AppSec challenges at startups versus large enterprises, his hot take on integrating security into internal tool development, and the importance of security training for developers. And there is much more. This episode is perfect for anyone looking to build a security program in a startup, whether for compliance reasons or not, or for those who want to learn more about breaking into the field. Dive right in! So, hi Rob, I'm very excited to have you today with us on the podcast. It was great to meet you actually in person. I don't often meet with my guests in person. The only time was besides in Arizona, it was actually great to meet you in person, actually to have a conversation about different security challenges after there as well. So it was very very nice. And now I've now starting the second season of the podcast, so it's among the first episodes. So I'm excited to have you on board. And your topic of expertise is really startup security. Now we've been in security in a startup, and now you have your own consulting agency for startups as well. And I think overall, in the industry, there is a kind of prevalent myth that attackers only target, large enterprises. It does not happen that often, with the startups. Like when I was doing research on the topic, I came across one case of Comma Free. I think it was in the end of, I don't know if you heard about this case. It was a crypto company that got attacked in, I think at the end of December 2022. And they got almost 1.5 years ago, but they got, I think, almost, 100,000 API keys stolen, and part of their database made public. And actually, since, crypto trading, the attackers could have access, to the crypto trading data of each person. So it seems it happens, that startups also get attacked, but I couldn't find a lot of examples, so I'm not sure. Is it? Do you think it's more common actually than we think, or is it just we hear kind of less about it because it's startups, and not as shiny for the media?
Yeah, I think that I think it is less common, right? If you are a large enterprise, if you're a Fortune 500 company, then you are going to see a much different pattern than a small startup, but. I think the big distinction is most of what you see at a small startup is untargeted attacks. You see a lot of stuff that is scanning the internet broadly, and you can just kind of get swept up in that, as opposed to somebody looking at your company and saying, okay, I'm going to go after them, and I'm going to spend months of my time, especially like a nation state attacker, right? That's going to focus a lot of time and resources at it. Because again, the question is just, what is the potential payoff? So if you are a small startup, but you work with very large companies, you get a lot of access to their data, their sensitive stuff, there's money involved, then you could absolutely be a target. But I think that most startups as a general kind of rule of thumb are less valuable of a target than the Fortune 500s of the world. But that is very much a rule of thumb.
Yeah. And what do you think are kind of the main, I said it can be like untargeted attack, right?
Yeah.
So why could someone try to in the first, like what could be, the reasons in the first place, like a security researcher, I don't know, suddenly came across some vulnerability, or like what could be the, different ways?
I think a lot of what you'd see at startups is, in terms of these untargeted attacks, is generic email phishing, social engineering for iTunes gift cards, that kind of stuff. That it feels silly, it feels almost irrelevant, but at the end of the day, they like work. So you have to actually address that. So I think a lot of that kind of stuff, a lot of generic just malware, potentially ransomware, that kind of stuff can hit small businesses and startups. So stuff that isn't like, oh, okay, I desperately want to get at this particular company, but it's just kind of going out everywhere. Even the sort of extortion emails. You get emails sent to employees that are, hey, I know what you did and blah, blah, blah. You have to give me a Bitcoin and stuff like that. I've seen all this stuff at startups with like relatively like common patterns. And then you get to the internet scanning. So, hey, scan the entire internet for any public databases. And then if they find one, then they exploit the fact that it's public with default credentials or something like that, and then use that to get into an environment and mine Bitcoin or something like that. Again, they're not even really trying to exploit you in particular, something unique about your data, but you have compute out on the internet, they're going to try to get at it. And then you have sort of generic scanning for public CVEs, that kind of stuff, right? So a lot of that stuff. And then sort of another layer of this that's a little bit less malicious is sort of people just running generic scanners and then asking for like a bug bounty, that kind of stuff. So that's also very common at startups. And you'd have to pay attention to it because sometimes legitimate stuff comes through there. And so I think that's the kind of stuff that I see really day to day at startups in terms of these like untargeted attacks.
Okay. Does it make, for example, for startups sense to have a bug bounty program in place?
It depends. I think it can. I think every company should just have like a disclosure policy that's public that says, hey, send something here. And, it's a little bit of work to triage some of the spam, but it's still worthwhile because I've consistently been surprised at the quality of stuff that will come through. I don't know that you need to pay people for it right away. You could probably wait for that. It logistically is a little bit annoying to try to set up. And so there's some resources that have to go into setting that up. Those resources could be spent elsewhere, but it's also relatively inexpensive because, most of what you get is not that crazy. And then if you get something really good, then it's probably worth it. So you can just set your bounties accordingly. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. You can do all this. All that's to say, I don't think a really small startup needs to do a bug bounty as a high priority. I think that especially if you're in like a B2B SaaS company and what you sell require, like a public researcher is not going to be able to get access to the application. It's not really that high leverage to have this bug bounty out there when people can't even get in and test the business logic, right?
Yeah. And you mentioned like you can't do all of this. That's a very common thing for the startups because I think no matter what department, I think startups, you can't do everything you want to and you just don't have the resources. So when it comes to security, what do you think should be considered, as a top priority to do and what can be, done later?
Yeah, I think you want to basically take all the different categories of security. So everything from security engineering, enterprise security, security operations, compliance, all these things. And you want to figure out what of this makes sense for where we're at, right? And you want to base that in what are our actual threats? What is the actual risk that we face? So I think for, generic startup X, without knowing anything specific about them, call it B2B SaaS or something like that. I think from the security engineering perspective, you want to have something that is making sure that you're not using incredibly outdated dependencies with a bunch of vulnerabilities because those can actually end up being exploitable. It's so noisy when you turn those tools on sometimes that you feel like, wow, this is useless. But the truth is sometimes there's just something that is, I can make one request to the web app because you use this dependency and then I, DOS your site or something like that. Those do happen, right? And so having something that is just in place and giving you visibility into this, even if you're not going deep on every single dependency and upgrading everything all the time, but you just have some sort of visibility with some sort of reachability analysis where you're saying, hey, is this dependency's vulnerability even applicable to how we use it? It's looking at our code, doing analysis, that kind of stuff. There's a few out there that do that. I think something in there is good to have, even at an early stage startup. I also think some sort of external scanner is good to have for a couple of reasons. One, very pragmatically, it is really good for your compliance posture. If you deal with any sort of compliance with regulations, with frameworks and standards, with customers, and they say, do you do vulnerability scanning? What you can do is you can say, like, look, our commitment is that we will do an external scan on all internet-facing production assets every quarter or every week or every day. And we will remediate all of those things within our SLAs and we'll be good.
Okay.
Those things are relatively low noise. You can do them not every single, push to production. And you can sort of manage that while catching like low-hanging fruit and satisfying requirements. So that's sort of like a bare minimum thing. It's kind of like the table stakes thing. So you're like, hey, put that in place and we can kind of play from here with different ideas and different timelines and different schedules. But from here, like, let's just get something in place. So some sort of external thing that looks at all your stuff and says, like, look, you've published something that's really low-hanging fruit, and from the outside we can see it. You should go fix that immediately. I think that's good to have. It's also genuinely a good thing is when you have that low-hanging fruit, that is the stuff that is most likely to be found by some sort of internet scanning thing that isn't really looking at you specifically, because it is low-hanging fruit that's detectable publicly.
And when should you start to scale? Let's say you have SCA tool in place, like that you've implemented as the first, first step. Yeah. And then, suddenly you realize maybe, or question yourself, or maybe I should get SAST, or maybe I should get DAST, or maybe I should get, ASPM now, or something for cloud security. Like, at what point should you start asking yourself these questions and scale your tooling?
Yeah, I think it's good to ask the questions relatively regularly. I mean, I don't think startups love doing the formalities of risk assessments and this kind of stuff and threat modeling and all this, because it is typically a very big enterprisey thing. But I think just doing a risk assessment can be a pretty practical exercise. I always recommend, if you're an early startup and you're not quite sure where your security program is, you don't have someone in place yet, you're trying to like figure out the rhythm, is put a quarterly meeting on the calendar for, the CTO or VP of engineering, maybe the CEO, just like the people who are most, the security team, even if that's not their full-time role, and get them together once a quarter and ask these types of questions. Say like, oh, hey, should we be investing more in security? And the answer might be, no, we're okay right now. That's fine. But give yourself a space to like ask those questions, then kick off any of quarterly things or regular things. Oh, we got to do our annual this, we got to do our quarterly access review, whatever it is. Do a quarterly meeting, right? Start there and ask these questions then. Very, kind of more specifically to your question, I think the order of operations in my mind is some sort of DAST tool, because if you have any sort of compliance requirements, just like throw that in place and you get a little bit of breathing room, right? So get a DAST tool, dynamic application security testing, DAST tool. Get a SCA tool after that. That's like the next, that's like the real investment where you're like, oh, we have to actually change some processes. You have to figure out a strategy for managing these results that come out of this tool. Get something in place that is very low noise compared to competitors, that kind of thing. And then from there, maybe a cloud tool. So maybe you're just going into Google's Google Security Console. I think that's the phrase, or the AWS Security Hub and Inspector and Guard Dude, all those kinds of things. But go use whatever tooling you have, or buy a tool for this, like a Wiz or whatever it is. That's the next big investment that I would say in this front is like, the cloud stuff is worth figuring out. You don't want to end up in a place where, hey, as you scale your developer team, people are going to make mistakes. People are going to put stuff in a developer Kubernetes pod in this isolated account. They think it doesn't matter, but all of a sudden you're, paying for someone to mine Bitcoin there, right? So I think that is worthwhile. And then, you can start to get into more advanced application security tooling and more complicated stuff. Or you can start to look at, okay, well, what are we doing for runtime detection? What are we doing for security operations? But that typically is like a bigger step a little bit down the line from some of these other ones.
Yeah, I think runtime for sure is a way bigger step, from the initial desk scanning. And
That's
you
right.
mentioned
Yeah.
as you scale, the development team, that sounds like the team, the development teams. If you would say tech tool or security tool, they are going to be quite small, but still big in percentage, related to other departments in the company. Like at Escape, we're quite lucky to have developers, who are passionate about security. I think I went with them, to OWASP meetup, and one of them, Kanton, he was super passionate. He did a presentation, he did a workshop, and he doesn't come from security background, really comes from a development and kind of infrastructure background, but I think there is still this kind of culture within the company, but it's not always the case for the startups. So how, and you don't have the luxury always for the training, for continuous training. So should you hire then already, developers with this kind of security mindset, you think? Or how would you make sure, that they actually kind of adhere to security principles?
Yeah, I think let's talk about kind of the stage before you have a security person or team or anything like that that's dedicated to it. Because I think then the question becomes, how does that person evangelize for these things? But I think as a founder of a startup beforehand, even, how are you going to approach this? I think there's two things. One, and you kind of touched on both, I think, but one is hiring. So if you're hiring a junior developer, junior software engineer, straight out of college or an intern, you can't have the same expectations of a senior engineer, and that's fine. But there is a core requirement of being a modern software engineer that is you have a basic understanding of security concepts and how to write software that is free of critical bugs, right? So I think that you absolutely can test for that in the interview process. You don't have to have a whole security round or anything like that, but you can test for these things and make sure they understand that, hey, this stuff is important. You're prioritizing this. I mean, the idea that security is an afterthought, all that's just outdated. I think that that's not even the case for most companies, most engineers, that kind of stuff. But you do have to weed that out, right? So you have to make sure that you're not hiring people who are like, oh, nothing matters. That's fine. We'll get to that later. There's zero risk of this happening. It's like, no, they have to be able to make intelligent risk decisions, understand when to escalate, understand when to bring somebody else in to address something. But at the end of the day, they have to understand what it is to not write a SQL injection bug or a cross-site scripting bug, why content security policy is important on the web, these sorts of things, right? And so you absolutely can put that into the interview process. Now, in terms of culture with your team, it has to come from the top down, right? At the end of the day, the leaders of the company, the CEO and the CTO, have to make it clear that this is a priority. Because even if you hire these great people who understand security, they're going to make mistakes. And so you put some tooling, some guardrails in place, and you put review process in place, and you kind of make sure that you set the tone that this stuff is worth taking a brief pause for every now and then and looking at, right? So sometimes that might look like, look, we're going to have a certain number of sprint points dedicated to security tasks every quarter or every sprint, right? Or spread it out over the quarter, whatever you want to do. Or you might say, look, we're going to have, one person this sprint is going to just go do this security stuff. Even though it's important but not urgent, and there's some urgent stuff, we're going to make sure that this stuff doesn't fall by the wayside because it is so important. And if you don't do that stuff, if you're constantly making compromises in favor of expediency against security, then you're just kind of spending all of this cultural budget where it's not going to come through any other way, right? It's not going to magically come through, some extra sprint points drop down to come and take care of security. No, you have to just say, look, sometimes we're going to say we're going to do this instead of doing this security project, but sometimes we're going to stop what we're doing here and we're going to go fix that security thing, even though it's not on fire today, because we don't want to build up this tech debt over time. And at the end of the day, if you don't build that rhythm in early and that culture in early from the top down, then it's going to be incredibly hard to find somebody who will be successful joining as a security engineer who's going to come in and somehow impose that on the engineering work from either the outside. It's not going to be a healthy situation. So I think the thing I would say is definitely consider putting this in your interview process, hiring for people with this skill set, because that is important. But two is, at the end of the day, you just have to make it important as the leader of the
team. Yeah, I'm sure like there are leaders that totally realize that and set all of this in place from the beginning, but I'm also sure that there are leaders that do not realize that at all. And I don't know if in your experience, especially from the consulting perspective that I started last December, did you see like the company where you arrived, they asked you for advice, you arrived and thought like, oh my God, that's a total mess from the security, like they're gonna be breached, overnight. It's gonna be so hard to fix. Did it happen without naming the
No,
names?
nothing like that. I mean, I think where we come in as consultants is sort of after they've made the decision that security is important. We're not just like, oh, let's throw money at these people because maybe
Yeah.
security is important. It's like, no, okay. Like they're going to bring us in. We're going to, be part of the investment they're making overall. So they definitely care about security before we arrive. And usually practices look super sharp and whatnot already. They just have some areas that they want some extra help with. But
Okay.
definitely, I think that if you went back 10 years, right, I think it's much more common that you go to a 2-person startup and they're like, YOLO all the way. Security is very much not even a topic of concern. But for a variety of reasons, I don't think that's the average case anymore. I think, if you go to a 2-person startup, you show up and they have just a ridiculously well thought out security flow process and tooling, even like they're doing stuff and you're like, oh, okay, you're way ahead of where I expected you to be. But the truth is they realize that, especially with B2B SaaS, but I think this practices is kind of bled into the rest of the industry as well.
Yeah.
It really matters to close sales. You can't get away with having shoddy security practices and still go and sell to very large companies. So I think a few things have happened. One is companies like Vanta have made SOC 2 more accessible to small startups. And this has caused more startups to go through this process and then have to consider security and then have to go through all this stuff. Whereas before it was kind of just like, oh, okay, that's down the line stuff. Let's like wholesale
the
box that
compliance
into.
was not. Yeah. Compliance
It
was
wasn't
not
right.
important. Yeah.
Yeah. But now if you're a small company, I mean, you can get SOC 2, you can get ISO, you can get PCI, you can get all these things that matter. You can even go down and get FedRAMP if you want. That's a whole other process.
Well,
but
for a startup.
it depends on what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
But all that's within reach, all that's accessible. It's more common now, right? So I think what I would say is that is one big thing. And then the other thing is large enterprises are more willing to purchase from startups, but they still have this machine of a vendor security review process that they then, point down at you, the startup, and you have to say, oh, okay, now we have to answer 600 questions about our security practices that to the level of expectation of, the world's largest bank or the Fortune 10 companies, right? And that process really makes you realize, okay, we got to pull everything up. So I think overall, everything's kind of being lifted. Some stuff in a silly direction, right? You have some practices that are just old practices that aren't as applicable to modern cloud environments that end up being kind of weird. But overall, though, nobody's just not thinking about this, right?
Yeah, I think definitely I can see like the overall trends, so the compliance trend and the purchasing trends are the ones that influence the most the security within the startups. Do you also think there can be like other trends potentially in the future that can enhance the security even more?
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's almost the perfect setup to say like AI, right? Like
Yeah.
I think that I think more broadly, the tooling is just getting so much better, right? I think that a big part of running a good security program is pulling in good tools, right? At the end of the day, you're not going to go and build all this stuff yourself. There's great stuff out there and it's just getting better. So I think that the tooling in the industry is getting so good. The vendors are getting so good. The open source stuff is getting so good. You add on this sort of like incremental increases in AI features, and all of a sudden it's all really, really accessible to small teams where you realize, oh, hey, it's not that I don't have to hire a team to run this every tool that I buy, right? You think about, hey, if you go buy Salesforce, right, and you're a certain size of company, you're going to have to like hire a Salesforce engineer, right, to like go and do that for you, or like a consultant. So I think that a lot of security tools have been like that historically, where you're like, okay, well, 10 years ago, I don't even know if the timeline, right? But 10 years ago, if you're going to go deploy CrowdStrike everywhere, it's like, okay, that's a big project. And now are you going to build a team to deal with the alerts and this, that, and the other? But now it's like, oh, you just can deploy CrowdStrike through a variety of means pretty easily. It's best in class EDR software. You can use their managed services to watch the alerts if you want. You can use another one to watch the alerts. You can put together an open source or a paid SOAR, SIM tool. Like you can put together all these tools if you just dedicate a little bit of time to it. And for, I don't know, under $100,000, you can have like best in class every category of tools as a small startup, right? Probably for a lot less than that. But you think about what that would have cost 10 years ago, and you're talking about a lot of labor costs, a lot of that, and you're probably in seven figures, right? So I think the cost of deploying best-in-class security tooling is coming down just drastically. And so that, to me, is going to drive great results at the end of the day. You're going to have more startups that are like the 2-person startup or the 10, 20, 50, 100-person startup that has amazing security practices and can actually handle it and doesn't have to dedicate so much human labor to those processes.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I saw you also hosted a webinar back when you were at Went on AI security, right? So where do you think the tools are going to use more AI to make sure the implementation runs smoother, but we also kind of a lot of startups use, not only security tools, but the tools that are based on AI, where potentially the model can also be a risk, because the model uses the training data from that's been ingested, because for startups it's the speed of development that's important, so they're using these AI tools. What would you recommend them to pay attention to, or what process should they put in place, to make sure that all those AI based tools that they're using, they actually do not compromise their security?
Yeah, I think a lot of that's kind of just being figured out by the industry as a whole. You go pay for OpenAI or Anthropic or whatever, and they're not going to train on your stuff. You don't have to go through a bunch of hoops. When you use the paid thing, it's just kind of like as a business, it's just kind of there. The API is not going to train. So all that stuff's kind of in the terms of service now across the board. There's also great development in self-hosted stuff. So a lot of startups are going to opt to just use open source models that they self-host or host in something like AWS, Azure, GCP's own managed services. So a lot of this is just, it's going to be, you have to go out of your way to do the training stuff. I think if you go one layer above the model providers and you say, okay, these software providers that are using these as a core feature of what they're doing, are they themselves fine tuning on my data, and what's their process for doing that? So I think there you have to go, and as part of your due diligence for bringing on a vendor, this should just be one of the questions you ask is, okay, how are you using our data? Is it secure, right? Are they ultimately the question is, are they using the same access control patterns in the model as they are in the application? In other words, can other users, if you're fine tuning on a model, how are you preventing that model from being used by other users of the application? If you're fine tuning on data, how do you make sure that the users within my tenant have different levels of access to that data depending on what level of access they had to the underlying data, different levels of access to the model. So I think just how are they making sure that access control and data security and privacy is all addressed in their application that's using these models and doing their own stuff on top, as opposed to just piping stuff to and from these underlying models directly, which again, like that's kind of figured out now. So I think that's all stuff you can just ask in the due diligence process. I think it would be unlikely, I think, that they're just going to wholesale lie about it, do all this stuff, and that's just going to be the state of the world. You can do that regardless, right? You can lie about how you're handling data regardless, so that's not unique to ML stuff. Yeah, exactly. And so, in general, I think that's not the biggest risk in my mind. It's certainly possible, but I think the biggest risk is just like, and from that layer, how are they handling it? What are their guarantees that they're making, that sort of thing. And then from there, just making sure that you have clear internal communications. I want to say policies, but not everybody reads policies. I think just genuinely communicating to people look, this is how we're approaching these tools. You can't use random Chrome extensions that you found that write stuff for you. You have to use this Chrome extension that's official, or this tooling, or whatever it may be, right? And so sometimes that means putting the security controls in place to block random stuff from getting installed. Sometimes it's just about communicating that policy to people and making sure that they understand it. But I think that's kind of the other big thing. And then obviously making sure that how you communicate to your customers and how you use this stuff is clear and the expectations are set there.
Like speaking about policies, actually some people do visit the escapes policy. I was surprised, but I can actually see that some people do read it. And speaking about like access control has been quite often something more for enterprise segment, like role-based access control is very like enterprise feature. From what stage do you think startups should start implementing access control? Because I know it's a big topic for us internally.
And so to clarify, do you mean in the product that they're building for their customers to use, or internally as an organization?
Internally as organization. Like that was the first question, but it can also be as a product that they're building, for developers, as long as the team grows. Not everyone with the same level of experience can have, ship the same kind of features and validate, something being pushed in broad.
Yeah. So I'd say internally, I think role-based access control is like the easiest thing to do. It's also a good security practice, but it's kind of the easiest way to manage this. It's very annoying to decide every time somebody joins what things they should individually have access to. But if you can put them in a bucket and then that bucket has access to all those things, fantastic. You can implement this in Google. You can implement this kind of wherever. If you buy Okta at some point, or OneLogin or whatever, you can implement it in there, or Rippling. Like, these things are available to startups. I think that role-based access control as a concept is pretty reasonable. Everybody should do that as the way that they do access control, right? I think instead of saying, okay, we're going to evaluate each person individually on what permissions and attributes and stuff, you start with the baseline of they are an engineer. Engineers get these tools. Whether we automate that or we manually go through a checklist, like we know how to onboard this person, is much easier. So I just recommend that's a good starting point even. You get more advanced with the automation. You can get more advanced with how granular it is. So you can get like role-based access control to certain services or SaaS apps or, roles in your GitHub org or whatever. But you can also then get sort of resource level. So you can say, okay, well, they can access this repo, but not that repo. And that's like one tier, or they can have this permission on this repo, this permission on that repo. That's like one more tier of complexity and stuff. So I think as you go through and you say, okay, we have to figure all that out. I think a question that I kind of sort of follow up with on that is, okay, so there's all your internal tools, but there's one in particular that almost every B2B startup and a B2C startup has, and that's how the internal tools they use to access and modify customer data. That's one where I think a lot of startups do very, very broad access, and they say kind of everybody has access to kind of everything. And you're a small team and you're like, oh, well, look, how many people is that really? But I'm telling you, that just changes overnight, where all of a sudden you're a huge team. And then a customer asks, give me the names of everybody who has access. And you're like, no, I'm not going to give you these names. But also you're like, that's a long list. So I'd say that's where I would really like push and say, ooh, that's so much easier to implement early on, even though it doesn't feel necessary. It's one of those things that I said this recently somewhere else, but like, there are some things that are, one-way doors and some things that are two-way doors. This was like an analogy that some famous person said. I don't remember who. And so when you make a decision and it's a two-way door, it's not that important. You can go in, you come back, you see what it's like on the other side, come back, change your mind. But one-way doors are like you go through and you're like, all right, well, we're here. There are some things, especially I've seen in security, that look like two-way doors, but are actually one-way doors. And how you build those internal tools is one of those things. So if you build those tools to support very fine-grained, just-in-time access, require customer approval, like this customer has to approve that I requested access to this resource in their thing. Like the more fine-grained you go, it's actually really easy to do super early. It's like an extra day of work while you're building the thing. And it's very hard, almost, it's so hard. It's so hard later when you have a big team of lots of different people, all these workflows that have been built up around this, because so much gets written about this internally. So much gets that is a one-way door masquerading as a two-way door. It feels like, oh, we'll just later on as we grow, we'll change how we do this stuff. That's fine. That's so much easier said than done. So that's where I would say the hot take is, hey, if you're building an internal tool to access customer stuff, think about role-based and resource-based access. Think about customer transparency, visibility. Make sure that audit logs are available so they can see what people did, and make sure that they can request or approve or deny that access. trivial to implement early on. So simple to implement early on. If you say it's not, I get it. There's edge cases, etc. You're wrong. Just do it. Because that is actually really, really hard later. That is like so complicated later. You have teams of people building work. I've done this, like building workflows and processes and migration plans and communications, and you're going to all hands telling 1,000 people, this is how we're changing things. And it's a nightmare, right? Simple
it's
to do early on.
On the other side as well, because I already had that experience where all my workflows
changed.
Because I had my access was removed. So
yes, exactly. And so if it's nobody's like gonna, it's very easy once it's in place to just roll with that. And you join a company, you're like, all right, this is how you get access to customer data when you need it. All right, cool, that's what I do. Nobody complains, nobody has a problem with it. It's easy. You have some backdoor escape hatches if for some reason the customer's not approving, but it's critical, or you're looking at a situation that like legal has to look, there's all sorts of ways to implement things that are, fine. But at the end of the day, that's one of those things that's so hard to do later, much easier to do early.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's better to start at the beginning rather than fixing issue with with the hundreds of people within the company. And speaking about that, now you switched, from vendor to consulting, half a year ago. So you went from the company, hundreds of people, to kind of your own personal venture. What made you do this change?
Yeah, I mean, I like consulting a lot. I was doing some kind of moonlighting consulting and stuff like that last year. And Vanta brought on a CISO, and I had been running the security program before that. And I was like, awesome, this is a great transition point for me to say cool, this is all in good hands now. This is a big company. It's growing fast. It's doing great things. I don't want to write performance reviews anymore. I don't want to do that kind of stuff. The big company stuff. What can I do personally to have more of the kind of work that I like to do? And, I love working with startups. I love jumping into a company and saying all right, what's going on here? What do we build? How do we build it? What are our practices? What are our problems? All that kind of stuff. And being somebody who can be helpful and has experience that's relevant. And so it felt very natural for me to say once I realized I actually could get enough business to sustain myself and build this thing. I was like, okay, this is a very clear next step for me. So I think, I had this natural transition point and I said, okay, let me go in and dive into this and see what that's like. And I've really been enjoying it. We have our first full-time person joined recently, a technical program manager, Andre from Robinhood. Yeah, thank you. And we're growing, scaling. We don't want to grow that big. We just want to be a nice little boutique consulting shop. But it's really fun. It's fun strategizing. It's fun doing all that stuff. It's fun working with clients. It's fun figuring out how to take security programs and the sort of best practices from this client over here and applying it to all of our clients and saying we learned something. How do we take that learning and take action across the board? And sort of everybody kind of gets the benefit of everybody else, right? There's almost a network effect, right? And it's a little bit indirect, but it's there. And so it's hard to do as well. It's hard to operationalize that logistically. And so there's all these problems to solve and all this interesting stuff to do. So yeah, it's been really, really interesting to see. And yeah, I just saw there's so many consulting companies out there, so many great people who've done this and scaled it and built cool businesses and companies and sort of brands within the industry. And it's wow, there's this whole path we can go down and sort of see where it takes us, right? And kind of just run the show ourselves, make our own decisions, and kind of sleep in our own bed afterwards.
Yeah, but I think the hardest part of it is to see probably the impact for you, when you implement something or when you suggest, something from the security perspective. Like I saw, for example, at Vanta, you implemented a service, I think, recognition service, for security controls. I don't remember exactly how often you run them, but kind of impact of the how much friction your security controls introduced.
Yeah, we do those biannually.
Yeah, so it's harder to measure this impact when you are when you come from a consulting perspective within the company. So I guess, at least I don't know if that was your experience. So that's what I've discussed, with other people who've been doing security consulting. Do you kind of have the same feeling, or do you succeed, to actually measure your impact, since startups actually the speed, of the startups is not the same as the enterprises. So if you suggest something, most likely it's going to be implemented,
Yeah,
much
pretty quickly,
quicker.
like that day.
Yeah.
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 If they agree, like if it's a good suggestion,
Yeah.
right? It's interesting. So, I used to be a penetration tester, and
Hmm.
there, like that was my first security job, was doing pen testing for Matisano Security. And there, it's like, yeah, you write up a report and kind of throw it over the fence and say, "Cool, we did it,
Yeah.
guys." And then when I went in house, my boss, he was like, "Hey, you have to actually go fix all these things now that you find." I'm like,
Oh.
"Ah, crap." Okay, so you kind of learn that like there's this other side of it. One of the interesting things about how Observa does consulting, though, is it's all retainer based, so it's all long term retainers. We the goal is that we're there for a very long period of time, right? And so we actually get to see this. So we aren't
Okay.
just coming in on a project by project basis, providing some advice, a report, a deliverable, and saying, here's your 25 page or slide PowerPoint, you're good now. We're
Yeah.
coming in and we're saying, okay, like, look, we're gonna own some of these processes for you. We're going to advise on some of these other things, and we're gonna help you with some of these projects and drive these forward. So we do actually get to see these projects from sort of inception to completion, and that is nice, right? You can see the maturity of these startups in the areas that they had less before. You can see that grow, and you can see them kind of level up across the board, and you can see that they're happy about it, that it's going well, or in some cases that like, oh, we did something and it didn't go well, how do we address that, how do we correct that kind of stuff. But you actually do get that like reward feedback loop, right? And I think that
Okay.
is that I think it would be a little bit frustrating to not have that, to go back to like sort of like the pen testing world or project based consulting world, where you're just kind of providing stuff and then not really getting to implement it. But it is nice in our model where we are actually often the ones that are like, all right, good idea, can you go do this? And we're like, yeah, sure, why not?
Okay.
So we typically we don't like write a bunch of software for clients. Like, we're not a software engineering consulting shop or anything, but we'll go and cut a pull request to fix a bug, or kind of make a small modification here or there. And so we can kind of get hands on in actually fixing these things, and then seeing not just like, oh, cool, the thing we thought should happen happened, but also, oh, wow, the client is super excited that this happened and they didn't really have to do anything, right? So you get kind of to provide that
They're
value.
very happy then. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, for sure. I mean, when you don't have to do anything, and that's the ideal scenario.
Yeah, it's a win.
Guess.
Yeah.
It's a win. Yeah. And if what would be your recommendation? Let's say someone in a startup wants to get a role, as the first security engineer. What do you think they should learn, and what do you think would be actually the main challenges for them?
Yeah. So let's say so are we talking about, say, somebody on a security team at a startup, somebody on like a software engineering team as a startup?
Security. Yeah, more
security.
You have already development team in place, but you're starting as the first security. I think depending on the industry, it's going to be at a different, size of the startup. Like at Escape already have a security engineer, so because we also work in the security industry. But I think if you low code or workflow automation tool, probably at the same at C-level, you're not gonna hire the security person. But if you at crypto, maybe if you're doing finance or say Web3,
healthcare,
then healthcare, then you are going to really think on that level about hiring someone for security. So what should they learn?
Yeah, so if you are being hired and you're like, all right, I'm the first security person kind of full time, and that was the case when I was hired at Bantam, for example, as I was the first like full time internally focused security engineer person. So what I would say is, first things first, you want to learn everything you can about the company's processes, like its software. You want to be the expert in everything. And that's a tall order, but it's definitely doable. The reason is a big part of your job is building social capital, right? It's building the trust of the organization. And when you can go to the finance team and tell them, hey, I need you to do something, but you actually understand what they do today, why they do it, and the nuances of that to some degree at least, then they're like, oh, okay, I get what you mean. Can we do this instead? And then you can have a reasonable discussion. But if you come in and you're like, all right, well, the last company I was at, we did this, and now you have to do that, that's not going to go over as well. And you're going to spend a lot of social capital and you might kind of run out of it. So I would say getting to know the company overall is the first step. You might even go and just like do your own security, go like dig into the code for a week or two and just like try to find vulns, try to find bugs, that kind of stuff. And just for yourself, like put together that stuff. If you find anything, obviously tell people, but just for yourself, like your own understanding, right? You want to get very, very familiar, get your head around all the technical stuff and then a lot of the non-technical processes. So that's one thing. The other thing is running some threat modeling sessions. So I like the practice of you jump in with just like a couple engineers or like a couple people from a couple different departments, and you say, hey, what are we actually worried about here? If you were going to attack the company, what would be the thing that's on top of your mind? You're like, oh, actually, this system we bought like 3 years ago, and they don't have any of these security features, and so it's all just like username, password, and this, that, and the other, and I'm really worried about that. And so you're like, oh, cool, that's a good thing for you to know. You kind of use all that as input into your own risk assessment. That can be a formal one because eventually you're going to probably start doing those, or it can just be kind of informally for yourself to say, okay, how am I going to start thinking about priorities? So then you're going to kind of look and say, all right, like where are we mature, where are we immature across the bounds of security engineering, security operations, corporate or enterprise security, and GRC, right? You're going to look at all that stuff and you're going to say, all right, where do I need to spend my time? Now you have a sense, now you have all the information you need to decide, okay, the next thing I need to do, I'm one person, I'm probably not going to get a ton of resources because it's early on. What do I need to spend my time doing? What's the highest priority thing? And that might be saying, hey, everybody needs two-factor everywhere. Everyone doesn't have it. We're going to roll out like WebAuthn two-factor everywhere or like YubiKeys everywhere. That's for you because you've done that analysis. You decide that's high priority. Great. But that gives you a really informed decisions that you can then go to your leadership and you can say, look, this is why I'm prioritizing this. These are the resources I do need. This is the constraints that I'm operating within. And you can gain their trust as well as the new security person. So long-winded, but I'd say that's kind of the first few steps that I would take as like the new security engineer, new security leader at a company.
Okay, interesting. And like I also always ask this question, at the podcast, what kind of books would you recommend someone to read to educate themselves better on the security, especially, in that context where you actually have to come up and build everything, kind of from the ground?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's definitely good security books out there, but I think if you're looking for books, if you're like a reader, I would say reading more about infrastructure, DevOps, that kind of stuff, SRE, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
That's probably pretty valuable. I would say, there's plenty of resources available to learn how to exploit cross-site scripting and that kind of stuff, but it's a lot harder to get your head around how to sustainably deploy Kubernetes in a high-growth startup, right? And so those are the problems that you're really interacting with, right? All of the problems that you're dealing with are problems that came out of those problems. And so understanding that is going to help inform your roadmap a lot more, I think, than understanding vulnerabilities, right? So I'd say that is, in my mind, a big thing, right? Is at a startup, like understanding the engineering side of it is probably like the highest value. The other thing I'd say is the things that make you successful in your career on this path is really technical understanding, being able to work with engineers, but also the business understanding, being able to work with the founders, CEOs, like that kind of stuff, and say, hey, like I understand the constraints in which we're operating as a business. I understand our goals. I understand that security is not the goal here. Security is a guardrail on the goal. And I think that so the more you can understand, like go through all the Y Combinators, like, startup school stuff, go through all that, understand the kinds of things that are going through the founder's head is going to really help you work with them to build a successful security program in the long run.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand that it's always going to be a trade-off between speed of development, and actual security. At least at this stage, and you need to know how to kind of sell that within the company,
exactly.
which is incredibly tough. And then, you have to win, obviously, the respect of the developers on other side of things, because, if you don't know what Kubernetes is, it's going to be
you're
very
going to
hard.
have trouble.
You're going to have trouble, for sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was very interesting conversation together. I think I learned a lot. I'm going to also send the link, I think, to my team so they can watch on some things.
Thank you.
I think, for them that could be interesting as well, because I think within our startup, the culture is very security focused. And especially for internal customer database, I think it's kind of our big topic,
Yeah.
I think, at the moment. Yeah. So it could be very interesting to see what they think as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.